I'm Doug Richardson, and I'm pleased to open this session on geographic research in human rights. This is part of several sessions that we're featuring here during this meeting, and this particular session builds on a cooperative effort with AAAS that began at our meeting last year in Boston, and in fact began a couple of years ago as we began to work together on these particular issues. We have 6 speakers today, so we're going to each try to be as brief as possible, about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have time for some questions. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of some of the activities that the AG is involved in. In particular, I want to talk about the Science and Human Rights Coalition that we're involved in. Nearly all geographers that I know are concerned about human rights, and in their personal and professional lives seek meaningful ways to act on these concerns and values. For the past 2 years, several of us at the AG have been working together with the American Association for the Advancement of Science to explore an array of issues, projects, and programs which engage science, geography, and human rights. This collaborative work has resulted in interesting and substantive developments in 3 areas of human rights activities which intersect with geography. Number 1, the creation of a new Science and Human Rights Coalition, of which the AAG is a founding member and co-organizer. 2, cooperation around a AAAS project on geospatial technologies and human rights, which Lars will talk about more later. And thirdly, the development of an AAG Geography and Human Rights Clearinghouse. I'm pleased to report on our progress to date on these programs and to invite the input and participation from all of you in them as we move forward. Firstly, the Geography and Human Rights Coalition. As I mentioned, for the past couple of years, AAG has worked closely with AAAS, including a whole team of people. Lars is one of those, but Mona Jonas leads that program, and a team of other scientific and scholarly associations to help develop conceptual and organizational framework for a proposed new Science and Human Rights Coalition, which is hosted by AAAS. The coalition is a network of scientific associations that recognize a role for science and scientists in efforts to realize human rights. The working goals of the coalition are to promote human rights awareness in programs within scientific associations, professional societies, and science academies, to facilitate collaborative partnerships between the scientific and human rights communities to address human rights challenges, to create opportunities for scientific associations to explore and contribute their discipline-specific skills and knowledge to human rights, and to expand the knowledge base of human rights organizations regarding scientific methods, tools, and technologies that can be applied in human rights work. Scientific associations that share the goals of the coalition have all been invited to participate as members. Individual scholars and scientists are encouraged to participate through their scientific associations, but may also be involved as affiliated members. The formal launch of the new Science and Human Rights Coalition occurred in January of this past year in Washington, D.C. Speakers included Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and former President of Ireland. And the AG, as I said, is continuing to work to help put that together. I serve on the steering committee of that organization now. A couple of questions that come to mind, that may come to your mind, is why have a coalition? The AG is already doing quite a bit of work in the human rights field and has been for a number of years. It's been a concern of ours. And I think that when I first encountered the concept of a human rights coalition, I was skeptical. I am part of a number of coalitions of associations, or you might say associations of associations. And in many of them, there's a great deal of talk and more talk and some posturing, a great deal of publicity and chest thumping about the good things that are being done. But often there's not much translation to some progress on the ground. And I found as I got involved in this particular program that for, I think, simply the reason of the compelling nature of human rights abuses in our world, that there was a great focus on trying to bring this coalition through all the necessary steps of analysis, of thoughtful approaches to what we might do, and to detailed ongoing self-examination and critical thinking about how we would approach human rights abuses. But also there was an urgency to make sure that some of this analysis eventually translated to ways to prevent human rights abuses and to do something useful on the ground. So why might associations like the AAG want to join these coalitions? Is I think the most obvious reason is that it's an opportunity to collaborate together with one another. Science doesn't find solutions in a vacuum. It doesn't find solutions with within only one discipline. Most large and important issues require interdisciplinary approaches. They're so complex that one discipline doesn't have the resources alone to address those. So most scientific research needs to be interdisciplinary to be successful. And this coalition offers an opportunity and an actual vehicle to achieve that kind of interdisciplinary approach, both to research and to resolving human rights issues on the ground. As examples, a lot of human rights issues that geographers might confront might involve cases, as an example, of large-scale environmental contamination, which we see frequently in indigenous areas and other areas around the world. Now, the AG may be able to document some of that. They may be able to provide some testimony at tribunals. They may be able to gauge that issue. But if it's environmental contamination, we might want to work with chemists. So in this coalition, we have the American Chemical Association also working together with the AG. We have anthropologists working together. We have sociologists. We have physicists all working together with a focus on this. So we can bring together that wide range of expertise in the service of human rights organizations and in the service of community groups. Another major advantage is that this allows an opportunity to collaborate as scientific associations with the human rights community. The human rights community is comprised of some of the most remarkable individuals in the world and with lots of experience, who have lots of experience on these issues. And I think that we have a great deal to learn from them, and hopefully we have something to contribute back, which I firmly believe that we do. Thirdly, almost all associations, certainly ours, has as part of its written and formal mission to bring science to the benefit of society and humankind, to diffuse science for useful purposes. This is a key part of the mission of our association, and it's also a part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27. So I think that internally we already have essentially the same mission in place, as does the coalition, though we often struggle on how best to implement that and in which ways. I think this coalition offers a new and very exciting and productive way to make this happen. In addition, this coalition allows us to pool our expertise and our scientific resources. Together, each of us has substantial things to offer. I know anthropologists do, I know chemists do, and I know that geographers do. We have over 10,000 members practicing science at various levels within universities throughout the world. When we pool together that membership and its talent with other associations, it's a truly impressive set of expertise. And working through the association network, we can access that relatively rapidly to put it together with other associations and to bring expertise to bear on crucial problems of human rights in a time frame that might actually make a difference in halting them. Then there are obvious internal reasons. These are the primary reasons, the external ones that drive me in this particular case. But then there are the internal reasons. Most associations are concerned, obviously, about the welfare of scientists within our own associations. There's been a long tradition of this work. And we've had many instances of intervening on behalf of our own members who have been, say, imprisoned in other countries or in other ways subject to repression or suppression of science. Repression individually or suppression of their scientific work. And so that's an obvious internal reason why we might participate. I think we also need to protect the freedom to conduct our science, which is a key factor in having science flourish and also in providing benefits to society. Finally, I think that learning from one another is a tremendous asset. Learning from other associations about their experiences with human rights, learning from the human rights community and its organizations themselves. This coalition that we're putting together offers a real and practical and meaningful way to learn from one another about how best to intervene in complex, sensitive human rights issues. It will help to build, we talk about space and geography a lot, as I know, but it helped to build a discursive space, I think, for the science and human rights communities to come together and find viable, meaningful solutions to some of these problems. And also, ultimately, through the years, I hope that we'll build a community of practice around these issues that will be valuable as models and as lessons for other associations as we move forward. So these are the few of the reasons why I think the AG should be involved in this and why we should devote some time and energy to making it happen. But I think for me personally and for many people, the most important reason is simply the compelling nature of human rights abuses. We're all human beings as well as scientists. And in our work, it's important, I think, to most of us that there's some meaningful engagement with improving the world. And certainly one cannot ignore human rights abuses. They're just too much a part of our collective psyche and consciousness that something has to be done when we encounter them. So, as we've said before, within geography and on some of our promotional material, overarching reasons why we can contribute include a slogan that we developed at the AG. What the world needs now is understanding of the world, which geographers have long contributed to, and also understanding in the world. And I think with activities like engagement in this coalition, perhaps we can achieve some of those. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Alberto Jordano of Texas State University.
Good afternoon. We just heard about the prevention of human rights abuse. And here I'm going to talk about what is mostly the most egregious, probably the most egregious human rights abuse in history, the Holocaust during World War II. I'll try to be very brief. I shortened my presentation a lot, so I will only focus on some aspects of the work that I'm doing in conjunction with other people. This is part of the 3-year-long collaboration with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, and the Registry of Holocaust Survivors in Washington. This collaboration culminated almost 2 years ago in a summer research workshop of historians and geographers at the Holocaust Museum, which led to an NSF-sponsored research project that just started in September. And the objective of this research project is to look at the geography of the Holocaust. It starts with a recognition, mostly by historians, that the Holocaust was a deeply geographical phenomenon, and that geography might help studying the Holocaust, might help bring in some fresh perspective. And these are our 4 case studies that we are examining, and I'm going to focus on the Italian one only. The research question, the overall theoretical framework that we use for our research is the concept of scale. This is a GI science and spatial analysis geovisualization project more than anything else. And so we are looking at the operational scales of the Holocaust. What can we learn about the Holocaust by looking at continental, national, regional, urban, camp, and individual experience, both in spatial and temporal, the spatial and temporal aspects. More specifically, I think the most important question we have is, what are the spatial patterns of the Holocaust? I'll try to illustrate briefly why we think as a group, collectively, that this is an important topic, important question. But if you think about what it involved, the movement of millions of people, first from, for example, cities in Poland, rural areas in Poland, to ghettos in Warsaw, and then movement to concentration camp, extermination camp. There were over 2,000 concentration camps. And so a lot of these involve movement of people, movement very often for slave labor. So it's movement, flows of people over space, basically. The establishment of ghettos that completely restructure the urban geography of many cities. The one we are studying in detail is Budapest, but that's one of our case studies. So it's an extremely geographical phenomenon that we think can be studied with spatial analytical and geovisualization techniques. What we are doing arise from historiographic questions. These are not necessarily questions from GI science. They have a GI science research component, but I want to make very clear that we are working in collaboration with historians to try and answer historical questions. And I have a few there, and I'm going to focus briefly on personal histories. But the role of bystanders is very important. It's one of the things that it's been studied more recently in the historiography of the Holocaust, which has concentrated for a long time on victims and perpetrators. Now the interest is who are the people who they did nothing during the Holocaust. And so the role of bystanders is very important. Another thing that is important is that recently have become available millions of records about the Holocaust. They were in a vault, basically, in Germany. The Red Cross had these records. And huge databases with a lot of information, including geographical information. And another thing that we are doing is geovisualization is very useful to try and test witness accounts. And I don't really have time to get into this, but we have already tried and do that try to test the veracity of concentration camp guards' accounts. And so I want to speak very briefly about Italy. Why Italy? Well, Italy, for one thing, is very well documented, extremely well documented. It's, I have, of course, I'm Italian, as I'm sure you can tell from my accent. I'm not from Texas. And so it's a personal interest, and it's not as studied as other Holocaust events. The Jews in Italy were not many, only about 1% of the population, and 9,000 non-Italians moved to Italy at various times during the 1930s. Italian Jews were very, very well integrated. Most of them were secular. Most of them were upper class. They spoke Italian. They felt Italian. They were not immediately recognizable. That's why, that's another issue, but that's why Italians had struggle with the concept of Jew persecution, because the Jew was not really different, but this would take us too far. On the other end, 22% of people were deported. 22% of Jews were deported out of the 38,000 that were in Italy in 1943. Relatively low number, due, we think, in particular to the fact that we're very similar. They were no different from the rest of the Italian, but very high death rate, as you can see. The way the Holocaust worked in Italy, Jews were arrested, interned in camps, and then transported to concentration camp, mostly Auschwitz. Most of the arrests were done by Germans for the first part of the Holocaust in Italy, which only started in 1943, by the way. Before that, there were no deportations from Italy. And then by Italians from December 1943 on. As Italians, we like to think that we didn't really participate in the Holocaust very much, but that's not really true, unfortunately. Now, what we have built as part of this case study on Italy, we have built a GIS of the Holocaust in Italy. 9,000 records, and I'm concentrate on a subset of these, which is actually about 7,000. And over there, I have in green, just to show you how geographical these records are. All of those green, they all have a geographical component. We have used this is the case study I'm working on. I've used quantitative and qualitative methodologies, and what I want to show you here is a way of making sense of the spatial patterns of deportations in Italy. And I'll get more into these in a moment, but individual scale, we're studying the individual scale, and I'll show you in a moment what I mean, with geovisualization and with spatial analysis. And for spatial analysis, we use a method called sequence alignment using genetics to sequence DNA. It has a link to time geography in the sense that you can study the patterns of activities, places, and times, which is a big link to time geography. What are we trying to do here? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. First, I wanted to show you, this is the first comprehensive view of the Holocaust in Italy. In black, you have places where people were arrested. In yellow, places of departure to concentration camps. And in red, the concentration camps. But I'm not going to really spend time on these. I want to show you something that is particular, and something that led to us studying the Holocaust in spatial terms. And this is an example, in spatial analytical terms. This is an example. This is the place of the departure of people that were arrested in many different parts of Italy and departed from Verona to concentration camps. So what we are trying to do here, in a sense, is trying to discover the spatial logic. What are the reasons for this movement of people? Can we learn something from looking at where people were arrested, where they went, why they left from certain places? Again, the objective is trying to unearth and discover the spatial underlying of deportation policies in Italy. And I'm trying to be, very, very brief here, so excuse me if I'm going a little bit too fast. But I want to show you what is probably one of the most interesting parts. It's personal histories. There is a recognition in the Holocaust historical literature that we need to look at not the fact that 6 million or 10 million or 5 or whatever million people were killed, but we need to look at the personal histories of each one of these deportees to dignify, in a sense, to go away from the big number and concentrate on the human, in a sense, a human experience, I would say. This is an example of a family of a mother, father, and two sons and one daughter. And this was their experience of the Holocaust. They were arrested at the Italian-Swiss frontier, and then they were moved around in Italy a lot. And then they left from Verona to go to Auschwitz and Buchenwald. One thing that is really intriguing to historians of the Holocaust is why all these movements? What were the reasons for that? And it's relatively easy to understand the reasons when you have a few cases that you're studying. It's much more complicated when you're trying to understand not the reason in an anecdotal form, but a structural, spatial reasons for all of these movements in space. By the way, this is what happened to these people, the two sons were sent to Buchenwald and survived, and mother, father, and the daughter did not. Now, I guess the question, the research question here is, well, why is this important, we think? Because it might shed light on, as I said, the deportation policies, but also might also be useful to study local issues. You know, what was special about this place in terms of the people who lived there, the kind of police that was there? Was these areas of Italy were occupied by Germans, by Italians, fascists, then they were liberated, then they were more in the, controlled by partisans and things like that. So it's important to look at all these places and see what was going on in historical terms, where was the war, what was happening there. And so I think this is one reason why it's important. Transportation patterns are important too, and these deportations occurred at different times during the war. And how does, again, war events influence the personal history of deportations of people? In the Italian case, it might help explain, this is another, I would say, objective of the historiography of the Holocaust. What are the national experiences of the Holocaust? How does the Holocaust in Italy is different from the Holocaust in other countries? One thing that is important here with sequence alignment, this is not a data mining technique. This is hypothesis-driven. So it's for discovery of spatial temporal patterns, but then what is discovered can be sliced according to meaningful, relevant victim attributes like gender, like age, and things like that. It has a very high temporal resolution and a high geographical resolution. And the example I want to show you is people who were arrested at the Swiss border, which is an important subgroup of these 9,000. These were people who usually did not have strong roots in Italy. The number of foreign-born Jews in this population is actually quite high. So it's a specific group of people that might have experienced the Holocaust in different ways than other Italian Jews. Very quickly, the way this works, you have activities that occur at places at different times. These are the codes that you see there. And the result is a grouping of people according to their spatial experience, meaning how far did they travel, how many times they were transferred from one detention center to another. One thing I should say that the activities that we have here are place of arrest, a place of last residence, place of arrest, detention in different places, departure, where they departed, and concentration camp where they ended up. So these are the activities over time, and that's what this is. These are the groupings. It's a tree. This is how they are grouped. And the personal history, this is the kind of results that you have. A spatial profile, if you want, of the personal histories of deportees. I want to show you very quickly what this leads to. It leads to grouping, to trying to understand how the spatial experience of people was shaped by geographies. How, what the different detention center, where they went, how they went there, etc., was shaped by geography. So, for example, people 16 years of age and younger have certain characteristics, departure from fossils, so they are more concentrated temporally than others. The non-Italians used to travel much farther. We used to come from much farther, and you to move a different, a much higher rate. They were moved around more. I have to to finish here, but this is the long term, and here we are talking about 30 years long term. Our NSF grant is for 2 years, but building a full Holocaust historical GIS. And what I think it's important is that there is a strong link to genocide studies. So the interest is not only for the Holocaust, of what we are trying to do, but also linked to genocide study. Genocide studies, genocide typically involves the displacement of people, transports, refugees, slave labor like in Cambodia, concentration camps and things like that. And I'm sorry if I rushed a little too much, but I thought I had more time. I apologize for that. Thank you.
This is a part of a larger project that I'm doing. In fact, one part of it has already been published in a book. And I'm trying to venture into something unknown, trying to find out how exactly demand works in terms of female sex trafficking. It's a really dangerous area to go, but I'm trying to venture into it. And at the outset, let me tell you that this is work in progress, and I'm trying to, at this point of time, making use of some of my geographical training. I used feminist geography, I used time, space, and place interactions in order to understand this phenomenon, and also I used development geography to see exactly where the source countries are identified in terms of sex trafficking. And human trafficking flows, as you know, demonstrate an intricate web of networks that connect most countries across the globe as source, transit points, and or destinations. The UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which is called the Palermo Protocol, was passed in the year 2000. And before that, there were international instruments that were targeted towards female slavery, white female slavery since 1904. But the UN protocol was directed towards the human trafficking, whether it is sweatshops, whether it is men, women, or children. In this particular paper, I address only female sex trafficking. It is only part of it, but it's supposed to be a large part of it. And also, this paper is on cross-border female sex trafficking. And at the very outset, I must show you what I'm not doing. The focus of the paper, what is not there, is it's limited to the issue of female prostitution and sex work, not to human trafficking per se. And also, I'm analyzing the competing basis for the anti-trafficking policy initiatives on the issue of female sex trafficking. And the questions that I have is, how do policymakers situate prostitution in regards to sex trafficking? And coming back to the UN protocol, it is one of the instruments where they used human rights. And they had three types of ideas or concepts that they wanted member states to use as a basis for anti-trafficking policy. Those were called the 3 Ps. And of course, they borrowed it from the United States government, which preceded it by using these three concepts: prevention, prosecution of traffickers, and of course, protection of victims. Especially in the connection of protection of victims, the human rights ideals, the norms were used. I'm not talking about the 3 Ps here at all. I'm going into an issue which is fundamental in understanding how people look at female sex trafficking. And this is why I ask this question, because member states are expected to have their own policies in relation to the UN protocol, which was ratified by 40 states in 2004. And one of the issues is the sub-questions, is prostitution in all its forms, sexual exploitation, and thus deemed as trafficking? And secondly, should free choice prostitution be separated as legitimate labor and then separated from sex trafficking? And so therefore, should sex trafficking be deemed as exploitation of migrant labor? What is interesting is that this issue of prostitution is at the basis of this contentious debate as to how you should look at it, and both sides make use of the human rights argument. That's the most important thing. The UN protocol, in fact, alluded to the human rights issue, but there was a lot of criticisms to show that, they were not very, they hadn't expanded on the concept. They had not really defined, and there was a lot of criticisms. I'm not going to go into that, but then there's the issue of the UN protocol for very good reasons, because these two sides were trying to debate, were very contentious. They could not decide where exploitation starts. You see, does exploitation starts when the woman is recruited? Is exploitation starts when the woman is then put into a brothel at the point of smuggling? So, and all these things, it was never clearly identified. And also with that comes the issue of consent. So in stepped other organizations like the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, which really tried to bring in the issue of human rights into the anti-trafficking policy initiatives so that the member states would really adhere to those norms. Then comes the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur for violence against women, and she also identified the issue of how this the movement becomes important. Movement need not be cross-border. Movement can be from A to B, from a place of residence to somewhere else. And then, of course, comes the United States government with this famous Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. And in the United States government, remember this was 2000 to 2008, and it was very much focused on aligning prostitution with sex trafficking. So it's a type of abolitionist point of view that I would be going into later in terms of analyzing the development geography aspect of it. And the main focus is how prostitution debate really underlies the entire policy initiatives of all the countries. You cannot get away with it. And there are these two organizations, the CATW, that is the Coalition Against Trafficking of Women, and it has a very specific abolitionist advocacy. Abolitionist advocacy means that any woman who is a prostitute is exploited, and therefore it is a violation of her human rights as a human being. Her vulnerability is being exploited, and that should not be tolerated. So therefore, prostitution is equal to sex trafficking. Then comes the opposing view, which you would know is completely almost the opposite. To a certain extent, it is called the GAW, Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women. It is the headquarters are located in Bangkok, and what they argue is what you call the free choice advocacy, that free choice means that women have the right to choose prostitution if they so wish. If they are informed choice, it is an aspect of labor, and you should look at it as a point of labor. The GATW is also completely against sex trafficking, so they would say we have to separate those women who want to make use of their sexuality to sell a service as labor, just like any other labor. But we should separate that from forced prostitution, and that forced prostitution should be female sex trafficking. So therefore, this has become very contentious, because the forced prostitution, the separation between the labor component and the forced prostitution is, in a way, very difficult, because for one very good reason, it is very, prostitution is stigmatized all over the world, whether you accept it or not as a legalized profession. And having said that, especially it is difficult to find the victims of sex trafficking. It's a clandestine industry. So how do you separate the two has always been latched on by the abolitionists, at least the CATW. And so this leads, in terms of policy initiatives, to different types of ways in which to deal with the anti-trafficking issues based on prostitution. Number one is in terms of regulating prostitution, that is legalizing prostitution. And I will show you some countries very quickly where they have legalized prostitution and said that they would legalize prostitution, and then law enforcement, they have passed anti-trafficking laws in order to try to catch the perpetrators. So much the perpetrators of the sex traffic victims, and then use protection to look after the victims of sex trafficking. Then there is the issue of legalizing in designated areas. Anybody who had gone to India would see that in Mumbai, I'm not from India, I visited India for the purpose of my research, that in Mumbai, in what is called Kamatipura, it has been there since the British colonial times, designated areas, red light areas. Then on the other side in Kolkata, in Sonagachi, again a designated area, red light areas which are legalized. And then there is this criminalizing aspect. That's a type of policy initiative, criminalizing the buyer. And you know that I show some examples of in Sweden and Finland, they criminalize the buyer. The intention is, the policy initiative there is to show that the human rights of the vulnerable should be protected. So the woman is the vulnerable person there. So she's not criminalized, but the buyer, that is the client, the man, is criminalized. And then, of course, the last one is to criminalize the buyer and the seller, which is called the prohibitionist. And for all intents and purpose, this is the type that we in the United States should have, not in Nevada, in some of the designated brothel areas, but prohibitionist in terms of criminalizing both the buyer and the seller. You see, in which case it's prohibitionist, it is abolitionist, which means they look at prostitution as equal to sex trafficking. So you can see this different scenarios, different policy initiatives that are based on the prostitution, and how both argue, on the one hand, that the sexual exploitation into prostitution is a violation of a human right of a woman. On the other hand, the GATW group of free choice prostitution says it is a violation of the human rights of a woman who wants to sell a service in terms of a sexuality to get that away from her. So it is a violation of a human rights for a government to do that. So how do you locate yourself? Which human rights are you looking at? Whose human rights are you looking at? These policies, so you can just see why the anti-trafficking initiatives are not very successful. Because it depends on where you are. And also, with the issue of globalization, two different countries where it's a destination and a source country, a person may be looked at as a person who can be sent back to the country of origin, which may have different views in terms of this types of policy initiative, and the woman would be caught in the middle. Women are caught in the middle anyway, you see, and this is an area where the policy initiatives are so entangled in terms of very highly embedded, entrenched ideology that it's impossible to extricate that from initiatives. And so I'm not going to go through this because these are Netherlands and Australia, where they have, Australia in some parts, Victoria, the state of Victoria, they have legalized. Sweden and Finland criminalized the buyer, but not and decriminalized the seller, that is the woman. And in USA, it is supposed to be prohibitionist. You see, you criminalize both, but most of the time, it is ignored. As you know, I can go into that later. And Cambodia and Nepal, I looked at it because these are two countries that I did my research on fieldwork when I was doing my first book and both countries have very prohibitive type of legislation based on the fact that prostitution is akin to sex trafficking. And this is, I just want to make the final few minutes in terms of the impact of US TVPA on aid conditionality, because this is development geography as well, you see. And the TVPA, that is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the annual Trafficking in Persons report is published every year. And it has a tier system, tier 1, 2, and 3. And every country is judged, of course not the United States, because the State Department would say that we can't judge ourselves, which is not quite true. Anyway, so that tier systems, that tier number 1 is government, it's about the governments, that they are doing they are actively proactive in terms of anti-trafficking initiatives. And Tier 2 is they are active but not quite there. So you have to be careful that they have to do much more in terms of anti-trafficking policy. And now they have introduced a watch list for the Tier 2, which says that they should act more efficiently in terms of anti-trafficking legislation, and they are on the watch list. And Tier 3 is, of course, beyond the pale, that they are not doing anything. They should be really taken to task. And how do they take them to task? There is a conditionality. Conditionality is, if they fail to take action, the United States government will withhold humanitarian aid to these countries. And every time that the U.S., we call the TIPS report, the Trafficking in Persons report, is published, third world countries are holding their collective breath, thinking that, oh my God, are we going to be in Tier 3 and humanitarian access is not going to be given. The idea is that the TVPA uses prostitution akin to sex trafficking. You see. So recently Cambodia passed a very stringent law in terms of equating sex trafficking, female sex trafficking with prostitution. So the conditionality is that you have to adhere. That is why I called, we have, not only me, there are several people who in their research has called the United States the global sheriff. Because they are monitoring and trying to show that this is the way it should be. So in terms of the human rights aspect, it is the type of all prostitution should be likened to trafficking. And of course, the United States also has what is called anti-prostitution pledge, that is for other aid, in fact, for HIV/AIDS related issues, and they have to show that they have to adhere to that pledge, that they will not do anything in terms of legalizing prostitution in order to get that money. And so therefore it is in fact issue. The last one that I will go very quickly in terms of prostitution is to address a question, pose a question to you on policy on demand. What constitutes demand? How do abolitionists view demand? It's very easy, because for abolitionists, demand is anybody who makes use of a prostitute is contravening trafficking laws. You see, it's very easy. But how would pro-choice groups identify demand? Pro-choice groups, it's a human right violation in terms of labor for those who go into prostitution as informed choice. So how would, when prostitution is legal, if that is so in terms of the pro-choice lobby, how would clients separate legal from traffic service providers? How would they do? Why would they want to know? And of course, we also have the Spitzer syndrome. Spitzer syndrome, as you know, the governor, of course, it was not a traffic case, but if it's a prohibitionist in this country, he was the only way in which he could have been taken to task was what is called the Mann Act, which was in the 1920s for transporting a sex worker across lines, and it's only a type of naming and shaming only. So what happens is, whether you have an abolitionist point of view or whether you have a free choice point of view, where the prostitute, the forced sex workers are part of it, there is more naming and shaming of the woman, and that is, of course, quite against the human rights aspects that we should look at. And so the conclusions would be the issue of prostitution cannot be separated from other factors that lead to female sex trafficking, of course, including smuggling and things like that. The individual states are informed by different sociocultural and political and economic consideration, which I haven't gone into. Policies are focused on law enforcement, and law enforcement is focused pretty much on prostitution. And, of course, lack of resources, even for law enforcement segment, that is what we hear from Finland and from Sweden, in fact, that there is lack of law enforcement even in terms of criminalization of the buyer. And lastly, do most states actually care? So it comes to a point where the debate is very contentious, because the contentious debate of prostitution, the policy initiatives are very difficult to be put into place and implemented. And top of that, it seems to be a type of a issue at the UN, issue in terms of rhetoric, issue in terms of type of feminist views, issues in terms of development geography as well, but in the final analysis, there doesn't seem to be much that has been happening, especially in terms of upholding the human rights of women who are involved in sex trafficking. Thank you.
So the Humanitarian Information Unit is an interagency center to identify, collect, analyze, and disseminate unclassified information, which is critical to U.S. government policymakers and our partners around the world in preparation for and response to humanitarian emergencies. And we promote best practices for humanitarian information management. So while our written analyses tend to be geared towards senior policymakers, such as the Secretary of State, we also do many analytical geospatial products. Those tend to be go up the food chain to feed the beast, as well as get disseminated publicly. We're also involved in strategic information management. I should also say that I am a contractor for the State Department, so maybe I could judge us, but it wouldn't mean anything anyway. So, just want to put this in since Darfur is very much in the news, and Lars can probably speak to this as well. One of our recurring products is we release a map with the associated data of villages that have been confirmed by the U.S. government to be destroyed or damaged in Darfur, and this goes back to 2004 or so. So we have a new update coming out very soon, and we have worked in partnership with AAAS as well as the Holocaust Museum and other groups in the past to release those data so then they can use them to corroborate with reports on the ground of attacks on villages. This is a relatively new project, but we're trying to use this to drive a lot of our work. And this is particularly in regard to Africa. We do cover natural disasters as well, but my work has tended to focus on complex emergencies. So humanitarian crises that are conditioned in some way by conflict, political violence, or civil unrest. So this is a map done by Dennis King and Besko Tsiris in my unit. The first version came out early last year. So for a room of geographers, it's nothing particularly novel, even if it's pretty to look at, but it's gotten a lot of traction within the halls of the State Department and USAID, and also a lot of the NGOs we've shared it with are very interested in it. It provides a good framework to think about conflicts, particularly in Africa, as generally not one state versus another state, but as subnational and as transnational. And the goal is to use this as a jumping-off point so we can break these down, break out each of these sort of conflict polygons, and really start to dig deep into all the factors that go into those particular conflicts. What I also like about it is that even though there's certainly a diversity and a broad range of conflicts depicted, it also does not rely on the nation-state paradigm and light up an entire country as being in conflict. And I think for me, it emphasizes the fact that the majority of the African continent is not in conflict, which is contrary to a lot of people's perceptions. So this kind of illustrates what we often try to do, which is not in our official mission statement, but we are housed in the Office of the Geographer on Global Issues. So our secret agenda is really to get people to think geographically within government, or our not-so-secret agenda, and to promote geospatial, geographic ways of thinking. So particularly for me, as coming from a more critical geography and political ecology background, this project is exciting because it allows me to kind of delve deeper as time allows, and we're trying to build partnerships and collaborations and have sort of force multipliers to go about this work. But it allows me to consider multiple actors at multiple scales, questions of politics, economics, ethnicity, all of the factors that go into conflict and development. So as regards to DRC in particular, our unit started following it before I came on last year. This is a map we did when in early 2008, when DRC was nominally post-conflict after the January Goma peace accords. The goal being to sort of establish a baseline of sorts, or at least set the stage. So we're looking here at IDP sites as identified by UN agencies, locations of the MONUC, the UN peacekeeping force in Congo, their locations, and then flashpoints identified by MONUC as potential flashpoints identified by them. The idea being to kind of track the situation as it developed. As we know, and I'll get into this later as time allows, the peace agreement between the main actors did not hold. And that's empty. This is just a little inset of another map we're trying to do to build onto the Conflict Without Borders project. And we are sort of starting to collect data from various places, but we're here we've plotted rebel groups, and again, this data is dated, the locations of various armed groups and co-locations of militia groups who are at some points aligned with either the Rwandan FDLR or nominally Rwandan FDLR, and with and in some cases with the forces of the government of the DRC, or at least rogue brigades of the DRC armed forces. So I'm sorry. So we're plotting these locations along with identified sites of mineral exploitation and mines, since the mines are obviously a big issue there. Now, this is one attempt we had going, and I did multiple updates of this in the fall when things really got hot, just to give kind of a quick and dirty snapshot to policymakers on a weekly basis or every couple of days as to what was going on, and particularly in regard to our focus of humanitarian access. So just kind of highlighting areas of control as reported to us by our contacts and by the UN and NGOs in the field. Now, this is something Lars will speak to as well, but we're also on the information management side. We try to engage as much as possible with whatever initiatives are out there, particularly geospatially oriented ones, that are trying to get a handle on these complex crises, and particularly attempts to do more real-time sort of mapping and dynamic mapping. Something like this can be useful, but it's a static representation. It takes time to update every time, and even though we're sort of working with dynamic databases, there's limitations in terms of what software is available and across platforms within government, not to mention for our mandate of sharing it more broadly. So there's been a lot of discussions this week as to GIS 2.0 and those applications, and there are possibilities here as well as limitations, which maybe Lars could speak to as well, or in the discussion. So I think I've gotten out of order here, but pardon me. So I do, in the remaining time I have, want to speak briefly to, so that's a lot of the stuff we've done. Now, as someone with a critical geography background, I've also been thinking about this concept of humanitarian space. And this actually came as well from the deputy chief of our unit, who's also a geographer, Larry Taylor, who was here this week. So we've been thinking about this concept, and we would like to develop it more. And as far as we can tell, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, it's not something that's been discussed broadly, if at all, within the geographic literature. I haven't seen it in the annals. I haven't seen it in the professional geographer. In fact, even the term humanitarian comes up maybe 150 times if you search back to 1990 in the annals. So that's interesting in and of itself, and it has some theories as to why that might be, which I'll get to in a second. But the concept of humanitarian space is often used specifically in the context of complex emergencies where there's some element of violence and a concern for that space. So it was coined reportedly by the former president of Doctors Without Borders, MSF, as a space of freedom in which we are free to evaluate needs, free to monitor the distribution and use of relief goods, and free to have a dialogue with the people. OCHA equates it with a humanitarian operating environment as a synonym, key element for humanitarian agencies and organizations when they deploy consists of establishing and maintaining a conducive humanitarian operating environment. And then Johanna Wagner at the ICRC has sort of situated the concept within international humanitarian law. Thanks. So she says humanitarian space can be open to a range of actors, both civilian and military, but space for neutral and independent humanitarian action must be preserved at all times within a larger and more diverse humanitarian space. So I think that's really important and something we need to delve into more, because there has been some discussion in and outside of geography about the civilian-military divide and implementation of development as well as emergency relief. But she does say that, humanitarian response can be done by military actors under certain sets of conditions, but there also has to be this space carved out within for purely humanitarian neutral actors, the ICRC being one of those ideally. And then the related concept of access, according to OCHA, is not a simple one-time effort, but a concept that involves dimensions of time and space. So you can see why I put this quote in here. Negotiation should always have a clear objective and lead to unimpeded, timely, safe, and sustained humanitarian space to reach this objective. So in trying to wrap up, there has been, in addition to these attempts to conceptualize humanitarian space, it's still a relatively ill-defined commodity, but one that people generally are saying is in decline. And I think there is some work to be done, particularly in places like DRC, to evaluate why that might be the case. And I think an important question is the relationship between human rights and humanitarian space. And I'll maybe raise that now, and we can try to discuss it later. And without going into the summary of DRC writ large at all, I would like to raise the following threads that I've been coming across that I think we could all look into more as regards to DRC, but that might be common themes in complex emergency situations and might help us kind of situate humanitarian space within geographic theory. So some of these things are the deployment of concepts of human rights and humanitarian space by combatants themselves, by negative actors. I almost said enemy combatants. We're not allowed to say that anymore. There are basic governance questions, the role of the state itself, and the whole nation-state debate, and the relationship between ungoverned space and humanitarian space. And then there's the international peacekeeping debate, the role of international peacekeepers and peacemaking versus peacekeeping, and the awkward position, particularly in DRC, that they've been in, the relationship with both the government and the population. There is the question of the International Criminal Court, ICC indictments, something I'll perhaps mention if we get to it, but Bosco Taganda, who is an indictee of the International Criminal Court, is now sipping tea in the hotel where I stayed a couple months ago quite comfortably, and is essentially allied with the recent joint operations between the Rwandan government and the government of DRC against the FDLR, the Hutu, the ex-FAR Interahamwe Hutu militia. And then I think an essential question here, and the reason that humanitarian space and humanitarian action is often separated from these questions of human rights, is that there are reasons for that separation, but it's also problematic at times, and certainly when we talk about response. So bridging the gaps, or thinking about bridging the gaps between emergency response and early recovery and development, and this relates to the whole question of conflict and post-conflict and pre-conflict, and where can we ever draw the line between those things? But those are very real tensions which you see worked out on the ground and create a lot of issues for people. What's notable about the definitions of humanitarian space is that it talks about the humanitarians and to some extent about their interaction with negative actors, but not about people, the people who are supposedly being accessed. So I think that's an important consideration. So I think I can leave it at that. I think there's been a lot of... I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to ramble on anymore. Thanks.
Again, I'm Susan Wolfinbarger. I am at AAAS, and I specifically work on the Geospatial Technologies and Human Rights Project, which is part of the AAAS Science and Human Rights program that Doug was talking about earlier. Lars is going to be explaining a lot more about the Science and Human Rights program after my talk. I'm specifically going to talk about one of the grants that we work on at AAAS, which is an Oak Foundation grant. And it's a continuation of work that was previously done and is continuing to be done on a MacArthur Foundation grant. And this grant, the Oak Foundation grant, is a dedicated partnership with Amnesty International USA, and through them to the Amnesty International Secretariat. And our particular focus is on forced displacements, secret detention, and mass violence. And this project, we're just beginning our second year. And so we're working on a number of different projects trying to further the work between geographers and human rights organizations, specifically with Amnesty International. And so one of these projects that we're working on is using geovisualization. And through this project, we want to provide access to tools that will support the existing methodologies that human rights organizations are already using, to typical methods such as on-the-ground reporting, interviews, photographs, videos that are often taken during situations as they're evolving. We also hope that by adding another level of analysis that we will be able to add a level of legitimacy to the field reporting through some quantitative analysis with geovisualization in particular, and to use these new data products to influence the policy making and decision making that are going on in relation to the different areas that we are focusing on. And generally, we want to use the geovisualization as a new way for groups to start engaging more with data sets relating to human rights issues. So the reason for the geovisualization project is using these scientific methodologies in an expansion of previous work that AAAS has been doing using satellite imagery. The satellite imagery projects have been focusing on individual events very specific to villages, such as village attacks in Darfur that happen very specifically in time and space, and are all events that can be seen through satellite imagery, so they have to be more large-scale sort of events. So now with geovisualization, we're hoping to start documenting issues that might go unnoticed without being gathered from different news reporting sources and being aggregated together, such as rape or civilian casualties, forced displacements. So with this work, we're hoping to move from a micro view of looking at individual human rights incidents into the aggregation into a macro view of looking at human rights over whole regions or countries. And so we also, through the we're doing mass media a lot for the data sources. We're hoping to be able to look at trends as they're developing by continuously gathering news reports for the basically usually international news sources such as BBC and UN reports, things like that. And we really hope to be able to locate trends as they're evolving in time and space and then be able to use them for human rights advocacy goals. So geovisualization, as has already been mentioned in several presentations today, is a really robust field of geographic research. A lot of geovisualization focuses on exploratory data analysis and the organization and integration of large data sets. I've listed a few of the authors and specific citations for things that we've been looking at and getting our ideas together for the geovisualization products. And basically the goal is to improve the understanding and dissemination of data to the non-technical audience that is generally the focus of human rights work. Human rights organizations are working with public audiences that won't have high levels of the technology knowledge, and so we need to create products that are really amenable to the use of these people, of the public, and to really try to increase their awareness through dissemination of the geovisualization on the internet. Which leads into the next slide, utilizing the new capabilities within the internet. More and more places around the world are beginning to have better access to internet. People are starting to use things like Google Earth really frequently. And so we are hoping to be able to take all these new ways of using the internet and integrate the information that we get from our partners, specifically Amnesty, to take the photos, the text, the video that they have from their on-the-ground reporting and couple it with geographic data sets that we create. And that way it'll be more than just a written report on a country or on a region. People will be able to really explore the different situations dynamically and really understand in a very clear way what's going on the ground. Because with the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words, I think a map is even more so, because you can really get a feeling for what's going on the ground and understand much more about a situation just by understanding where it's located in time and in space. So we also hope that the use of the geovisualization will also disseminate information faster, as it'll be housed on particularly Amnesty International's websites. So hopefully once data products are created, they will be disseminated around across their advocacy networks very quickly. So one of the things we had to think about was, when we wanted to do a geovisualization project, was what to do. What kind of data will we need? What kind of data, what can we appropriately show with the data that we can find? And also we were interested in trying to use some of the new methods for visualization that are available for low cost or little cost, such as time sliders, which you can find in Google Earth, and there are free ArcGIS extensions that do time sliding. Cartograms, which have been very popular, especially in election issues. You've all seen the red state, blue state cartograms, and also a spatial flicker, so that the photographs that people take can be tied to specific locations within a geovisualization. So our main issue is to create products that are really going to be easily understood, because people that are going to be interacting with the data are going to be at home on their home computers. You don't want to have large amounts of instructions to tell people what to do to understand all the different things that are going to be within the map products. And so that's why we're going to be focusing more specifically thus far on density analysis, cartograms, time series, and a number of different charts, line and bar graphs, all those sorts of things. We have a couple of test projects that we're working on, one in Darfur and one in Pakistan. I'm going to focus on the Pakistan one for the presentation today. The data source for this project was mass media reporting, as I mentioned earlier, from things like the BBC. The database structure was created by Amnesty's International Secretariat Pakistan research team, and they also populated the database. The geocoding of the locations and the incidents was done in-house at AAAS, and the reporting time frame was from 2001 to 2008. Just a note is that I don't have nearly as much to present today as I was hoping, because I only got the Pakistan database last week. So I was hoping to have the entire site done by now, but we're at the very beginning stages. But that's what happens when you're working with people across organizations and across countries. So one of our main problems is geocoding. A lot of the places that we work with are relatively unknown. There's no naming conventions. So Lars has developed a fuzzy matching system that's basically like a spell checker for finding out if you have a name of a location. It'll tell you other names that are spelt similarly, so that you can find latitude and longitude information for them. And we're also going to be doing our analysis on a number of different levels, from all the way from individual incidents up to the regional levels. Quickly, I will show you just the beginnings of the project. So the Pakistan project focuses on the tribal areas of Pakistan, the northwest frontier provinces, and the federally administrated tribal areas. And so this first map here on the right would be a typical kind of map that we would be interested in doing. This is after geocoding all of the events in the database, I then created a density map. And so people would be able to see something like this and you can look at it, and anyone can understand what's going on with this but say I was going to give you a kind of an example of what maybe someone might find out through the database. You can see that there's a large concentration of incidents in SWAT in the northern part of the country. So a person that might be interested in finding out why there's so many human rights abuses in that area could then look at some of the other visualizations, such as the number of civilians killed, which is also really high in the same province, and also could find out that the largest numbers of women and children were also killed in that same area. And finally, then a person could also then navigate into the area specifically and be able to map out a timeline across all the years of the incidents and find out that all of these incidents occurred in 2008. And so there was an explosion of violence specifically that was covering against women, lots of women and children casualties, and general civilian deaths during that time period in 2008. And so these are the kinds of trends that we're trying to look for in the data. And so I will wrap up basically trying to visualize mass media reporting and couple it with the on-the-ground reports and videos that will be added into the geovisualization product on the website. The web server application is currently being developed between Amnesty International and AAAS, and we really hope that by using this web server that's going to be created a modular type of product so that different countries, different areas that we're going to be focusing on can be added into that, and easily you can create a new project for a new location. It's not going to be a single project, Pakistan, and then you have to recreate the wheel to go on to the next project. So we're really hoping to really change a lot of the ways that advocacy is being done, really tying it into the mass media and coupling it with traditional methods. I can share the references with you at some point if you're interested, and there's my contact information.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'd like to observe that, you know, the folks that take on these kinds of projects and these kinds of jobs have to review and see an awful lot of the worst of human nature. And I think it's brave of people to do that, and also to deal with the kinds of things that most people want to turn their eyes away from in order to get some information that could be useful in the future. So I'd like to thank Susan and Lars and all the others who've taken on these kinds of projects. Our final speaker is Lars Bromley, who's with the AAAS, and Lars is going to speak to us about engaging human rights organizations. Lars?
Essentially, over the last few years, I've had the privilege of directing a project at AAAS on geospatial technologies and human rights. As we've mentioned, this project is part of the Science and Human Rights program at AAAS, which has been around for about 30 years. It was originally established to defend persecuted scientists, then through kind of an organic process got into pioneering applications of science and technology for human rights purposes. This has largely included initially forensic and genetic sciences, so how do you dig up graves and mass graves and exhume bodies and learn anything from them that's valid within a human rights context. We've also done a fair amount of work on statistical and information management techniques. So how do you, for example, interview thousands of refugees and come up with a defensible data product on where those refugees came from, what time they left or what date they left their homes, things like that. So my work on geospatial technologies is just kind of an extension of what came before. We got started in 2006 with a pilot project which was funded by MacArthur Foundation. That was followed by a more substantial 3-year grant also from MacArthur Foundation. We have a new grant from the Oak Foundation, which is what funds Susan's time and the direct interactions with Amnesty International USA. We've also been funded by Open Society Institute, specifically to work on Burma. I also steal a fair amount from AAAS, so if you're a member, thanks a lot. And we'll be doing this sort of stuff at least until the end of 2011. The objectives of the project are basically to explore applications of geospatial technologies to international human rights work. And we tend to focus on mass violence and other major violations of human rights norms, not exclusively, but that's what we spent most of our time on. We would then document those applications and produce documentation on our website, and seek to develop the human resource infrastructure for long-term impact, which is what brought us into working with the AAG and staff there and other organizations. We try and work mostly directly in partnership with NGOs, and these are groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are probably the best well-known. There's a slew of smaller organizations, groups like Akitas in Colombia, U.S. Campaign for Burma, Free Burma Rangers, Care and Human Rights Groups, and about 1 billion and one others. They tend to form networks and alliances of groups, and really how we view them is distributed information networks. We can do this from our offices in Washington, D.C., because there are people right now who are infiltrating into Burma and sending us information on what they're doing, and that information tends to propagate through a variety of networks, which is a whole other fascinating topic that we could get into. We also do our work on case study areas. It's not an abstract conceptual thing. We try and work on specific areas as crises develop or are ongoing. So these are areas like Darfur, Burma, Ethiopia, Lebanon, South Ossetia, Zimbabwe, and Pakistan, which was the previous talk, not the next talk, and elsewhere. Some of the major constraints when you're engaging human rights organizations is that they tend to be relatively low-tech, and there's a variety of reasons for this, but the kind of leather-bound journal is not out of the question. It's not kind of a high-tech, high-computer environment. 2 people in a back room kind of collecting news reports is a very common model for a human rights organization. They also tend to be very fragmented and dispersed and independent, and that has advantages, like I mentioned, and also disadvantages. They have vastly broad objectives. Going in the world from advocacy to actual litigation is a distance that can be very, very difficult for any organization to cover. And when we try and work with different organizations, we are often asked to kind of do advocacy work and litigation work kind of all at the same time. Just by definition, these groups are going to be low on funds, and therefore research and development is not really a priority. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast. Source protection, their information sources tend to always be vital. As much as possible, we will do what we've done with the Pakistan project and kind of kick out information to, or only use information that we publicly that comes from news sources, because protecting the original source of information from what they call reprosecution is incredibly important. Essentially, if we produce a report where so-and-so says something about a human rights violation, that's kind of a ticket for that person to be imprisoned and perhaps tortured or something like that, basically prosecuted once again. And just little interesting things that come up, things like GPS and digital cameras can often be a cause for persecution. We run into this frequently in Burma, where we would be happy to supply all sorts of equipment, but it's kind of invites trouble. So we've been a little more reluctant to do that. And in general, regular repression and reprisal of some of the groups that we're working with is pretty common, especially in Zimbabwe and Burma. So, for example, Zimbabwean staff will often disappear and they'll be imprisoned, and when they are released, it's pretty heartbreaking what actually happened to them. And also, just on a practical concern, the areas of concern that these groups are dealing with are simply massive. I mean, Darfur is a huge area. Burma is a huge area. Eastern Congo is bigger than both of them put together, probably. So, I mean, when you start talking about specific instances within these areas and you really want to know where they're happening, that's just an immense challenge. As we've gone through this project, kind of some common needs have come up that I'm going to talk about. The first one is a satellite-based human rights observing system. The second one is an integrated research and monitoring system. Then a real-time event reporting system. And then there's kind of a set of specific interfaces and networks that we feel should be developed, and in a world of unlimited budgets, we would develop them. Jumping right into the satellite observing system, We tend to draw mostly from high-resolution commercial satellites. This is a little software tool that allows you to plot the location of different satellites at any time. We use this to figure out what satellite might be the best option for an image acquisition at a certain time in a certain location. You can also see from this example that they're all over the ocean, which illustrates how perfectly useless they are 99% of the time, and that's an important consideration. These things aren't, cameras floating in the sky that are always looking down on us. They're overhead for a picosecond every few days at best, and so getting the imagery that you need is not a given. Even if you get access to the satellite, figuring out where you want to point it is a big issue. This is just a simple map that we produced a couple of years ago when we were working on Zimbabwe. And it's interesting because we were able to pull together data from Digital Chart of the World, Department of Defense, NGA GeoNet name server, and then a GeoCover Landsat image, and make a map of Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, email the map to contacts there, and they were able to say, okay, you drive out the road to the north, and when you get to the lake, our house or our village was on the right. And that's really one of the ways that we kind of engage with these organizations, keep it very low-tech, very, very simple, to come up with things like latitude and longitude. The Zimbabwe project, I'm only going to show one of these samples, but basically this was a quick bird image of a town called Port-au-Farms. As it existed in 2002. There were 870 structures in this area as part of essentially a voter intimidation campaign by the Zimbabwean government. This town was completely destroyed. And we were able to basically get another image of this location after the destruction. We did this in partnership with Amnesty International and a local group called Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. And this image set was eventually submitted to the African Union Human and People's Rights Court. One of the frustrations that we deal with the legal aspect of these things is that the legal cases can drag on for years and years and years and years. So we're often asked, has this image been actually used yet? And it's basically been on hold for a couple of years. Using high-resolution imagery, you can also do things that are a little bit more proactive. This is another thing we did with Amnesty International called Eyes on Darfur, where we were looking at specific instances of destruction occurring within a specific time frame in Darfur. In addition to documenting past destruction, we also wanted to essentially be proactive and try and protect certain villages. So we came up with a short list of about a dozen villages in the region, and we regularly acquired imagery of those locations, so Amnesty could basically make the point that they were watching these locations. And two of the locations did suffer some damage while we were doing it, but in general, the bulk of them are still intact today, as far as we know. There's a lot of limitations that are of importance to human rights organizations, primarily an ethical concern. Satellites are owned by commercial entities, and militaries and governments tend to be their biggest clients. And this can be a big deal for some of these organizations that we deal with. They don't want, they're a little bit cautious when they start getting into this realm. As I mentioned, these images are snapshots in time, largely acquired since the year 2000. So if there's no imagery in the archive, that's it. These things aren't time machines. There aren't other satellites out there that we just haven't discovered yet and we could get imagery from. It's a pretty straightforward process of trying to locate imagery. This is less of a problem as time goes on and we get more satellites and the archives get deeper and deeper and deeper, but it's still an issue. And a lot of possibilities just don't have the imagery to support them. Given the number of satellites, rapid response and real-time use is very problematic so far. There's competition for the satellites. If I place an order and someone places a bigger order, that means I'm not going to get my order until they get theirs. Clouds interfere, obviously, and it can be months before new images arrive. And that's a very frustrating time frame to work on. So there's difficulties in locating precise coordinates, which also slow things, and just some other practical details on this issue. We are currently basically writing papers that document, how quickly can you get imagery and how completely can you get imagery, and also given a set of town names, how can we precisely locate how can we precisely locate the towns given available data? We don't just do high-resolution satellites. This is some research that I've done on using fire detection from MODIS. So this big spike here is the height of the genocide in Darfur in 2003, which resulted in a huge increase in the number of fires. This crude map over here on the right kind of shows the concentration of where the fires were highest compared to previous years. Since MODIS gives data 4 times a day, you start to get this possibility of a real-time reporting system. It's very, very limited, but there is some possibility there. Moving on, getting into kind of the text-based stuff, which Susan talked about, we are spending a fair amount of time developing monitoring and reporting systems. There's a system out there called HeroSearch, which essentially already catalogs an awful lot of human rights information. So how do we essentially spatialize that and plug it into a GIS framework? For example, this is a map that if you take all the public reporting on Darfur to date and geocode it, this is where essentially events have taken place over the last several years. The sheer quantity of the information is problematic, and it's extremely laborious to actually do this. We're working to automate the process, but it's very, very difficult. On real-time event reporting systems, these are similar to the previous, but obviously the real-time issue is the big one. I'm going to mention a project called Ushahidi, which was developed in Kenya, which basically ingest data via the web or via an SMS text message to essentially enable this kind of distributed reporting system. And there's also simpler systems. Something called slaverymap.org uses just a web-based map, and you can kind of input your own information in to show where forced labor is occurring. This is just a screenshot of the Ushahidi system as it collected information in Kenya during the post-election violence a couple of years ago. Some other things of interest to this community, indigenous land rights and mapping are a big thing and a big kind of untapped area. We know there's strong networks out there, but how to really connect those networks together and get communities outside their spheres of influence to get access to these resources is a very important question. Also, census-based analysis of discrimination, inequality, and et cetera. There's another session on this, so I won't get into this. Really what we're looking into is what works in the legal sense. Also, an interesting sort of project is if we want to monitor a massive construction project in remote areas, that's a very inherently kind of spatial question, uses a lot of GIS sorts of tools and satellite imagery, connecting kind of local level monitors with out-of-country monitors, which is a process that we're looking at. We are interested in tapping into the AAG and geographers in general. We are developing a database which will be kind of an online Rolodex of people and resources that human rights organizations can make use of. The initial version was developed primarily by AAG staff. We're building on that and working with them. We're moving it online, and we essentially just to hope to connect all these organizations together. We have a little basket in the back if you want to drop a business card in there or if you want to talk to me afterwards. We are very tenacious, and we will find all the organizations, but if you want to make our job easier, that would be very, very nice. That's my contact information. Please do let me know if you have any questions or if you want to talk about this any further. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the panelists. I mean, I'm so proud to be associated with these geographers who are doing such courageous work and such hard work in the human rights area. Let me close by saying that with support from the MacArthur Foundation via AAAS, we've been developing a large bibliography on research that's been done on geography and human rights. We're also developing, independently of that, a geography and human rights clearinghouse on the AAG website. And that clearinghouse will include that bibliographic information as well as updates on what's going on with many of the related organizations, including many of those speaking today.